When people hear that NATO has launched a major exercise in the Baltic, they tend to imagine symbolism first. Flags in port, admirals on the stage, ships leaving harbor in neat formation. Those images are real, but they are not the heart of the story. The heart of the story is narrower, colder, and more practical. NATO is rehearsing how to hold a difficult sea under pressure. NATO just launched BALTOPS 2026. Why does that matter? Because the Baltic is not a forgiving body of water. It is crowded, shallow in places, easy to surveil, exposed to mine threats, and politically loaded. It is a sea where civilian shipping, naval movement, reinforcement routes, air defense problems, and alliance credibility all exist inside a compressed map. That means a Baltic exercise is never only about seamanship. It is about whether a coalition can move, command, and protect itself inside a region where very little can be hidden and very little can be improvised once pressure begins. This is not a claim of secret access. It is a public tactical reconstruction built from current official releases and the known logic of Baltic maritime operations. On June 4, 2026, U.S. 6th Fleet said BALTOPS 2026 had taken sail from Guinea, Poland. It described the exercise as the 55th iteration of BALTOPS and said the 20 NATO ally ships departed Guinea at the start. The release also laid out the mission set clearly: amphibious operations, air defense, anti-submarine warfare, mine countermeasures, crisis response, and unmanned systems experimentation. Those words matter because together they describe a coalition rehearsing not just visibility, but survival. The Danish armed forces said much the same thing in slightly more direct language. Denmark described BALTOPS as a major U.S.-led naval exercise underway in the Baltic Sea and said the purpose was to strengthen Denmark's and NATO's ability to defend the Baltic region and maintain security, stability, and freedom of navigation there. It also said that the exercise is the largest one conducted in the region. That phrase is worth slowing down on. Largest in the region is not just a brag, it is a description of scale applied to a very specific geography. The Baltic is one of those places where geography and strategy are too tightly connected to separate cleanly. The sea itself is not vast by ocean standards. That is exactly what makes it hard. If you want to move warships, escorts, supply traffic, or reinforcements through the Baltic under tension, you are doing it in a space where sensors, mines, coastal missile risk, air power, and civilian movement all compress the timeline. Narrow seas punish hesitation because there is less room to recover from bad sequencing. That is why BALTOPS matters more as a rehearsal than as a spectacle. A wide ocean gives a fleet space. The Baltic gives a fleet consequences. If NATO wants to reinforce the Baltic states, protect maritime movement, deter Russian pressure, or keep shipping routes viable in a crisis, it has to prove that Allied ships, staffs, aircraft, and support systems can act inside a shared command picture. That is not achieved by simply putting more hulls in the water. It is achieved by taking several difficult mission sets and making them work together without wasting time, space, or attention. Mine warfare is the clearest example. The Baltic is a place where mines matter because they do not have to sink many ships to impose major operational costs. A mine threat changes everything. It changes routing. It changes timing. It changes priming. It changes envoy spacing. It changes amphibious planning. It changes how confidently logistics ships can move. It also changes politics because the more time a coalition spends clearing water, the more time an adversary gains in shaping the next phase of the crisis. That is why BALTOPS keeps returning to mine countermeasures. This is not niche specialist work tucked quietly in the background. It is central to the question of whether NATO can keep the sea open. Recent DVDS footage from BALTOPS 25 and Baltic explosive ordnance disposal operations reinforces that point visually, even if those older clips are not proof of 2026 composition. The pattern is consistent. If you cannot search, identify, neutralize, and verify the lane, then the rest of the fleet becomes slower, more cautious, and easier to trap into defensive timing. Anti-submarine warfare is the next layer of the problem. In a narrow sea, a submarine does not need to control the whole battle space to impose anxiety. It only needs to create doubt about where the safe water begins and ends. NATO therefore uses BALTOPS to work the quiet, disciplined side of maritime pressure, maritime patrol aircraft, sonar prosecution, screening, classification, and the handoffs required to turn fragments of acoustic evidence into something commanders can actually use. The public sees aircraft and ships. The operational reality is a coalition teaching itself to trust one another's sensors and decisions at short notice. Air defense belongs in the same conversation because the Baltic does not let naval and air questions stay separate for long. If a fleet is visible, it is targetable. If it is targetable, then command decisions, escort formation, radar discipline, and response time all matter more. Air defense in this environment is not just about shooting something down. It is about holding the confidence of the whole force. The fleet has to believe its sensors are aligned, its timing is clean, and its commanders can react before threats compress the decision space. This is one reason the 2026 command structure change is so important. 6th Fleet said that for the first time since 1972, BALTOPS is command and controlled from Allied Joint Force Command Brunssum under a NATO command structure. That may sound bureaucratic. It is not. It means the alliance is using the exercise not only to move units together, but to stress a real command framework that would matter in an actual crisis. Command arrangements are often the weakest part of coalition warfare because every nation can bring ships and still lose time in the handoff between national procedure and alliance procedure. So when BALTOPS 2026 shifts command in this way, it is not just changing paperwork. It is testing whether NATO can compress political alliance structure into an operational command rhythm. That rhythm matters because the Baltic is not a place where slow coordination is forgivable. Reinforcement windows are short. Escort logic has to be clear. Amphibious timing has to connect with air cover and sealing security. Crisis response cannot become a set of separate national performances. If it does, the region starts punishing the coalition immediately. Amphibious operations are another misunderstood part of this exercise. People hear the term and think only of large-scale beach assaults. In modern alliance practice, amphibious work is broader than that. It is about moving force, equipment, and options across water in a contested or uncertain environment. It is about literal access, multi-domain timing, and the ability to project a response without assuming that every pier and every route will remain available. In a Baltic crisis, amphibious capability is not just offensive. It can be part of reinforcement, dispersal, deception, and the preservation of flexibility. That is why the older BALTOPS footage of HIMARS moved amphibiously in Sweden still matters as visual context. It points toward the deeper logic of the exercise. BALTOPS is not teaching one ship to do one task. It is rehearsing how separate systems, services, and national units can be made to arrive in the right sequence when the region stops behaving politely. The Danish account of the exercise structure is useful here. It says the exercise is built in two parts. First comes unit and combined arms training. Then comes the tactical exercise phase, where the forces face realistic scenarios they must handle together. That two-stage structure matters because NATO is not only training individual competence, it is training the shift from competence to consequence. A crew can be individually proficient and still fail in coalition timing. BALTOPS exists to close that gap. Escort operations are one of the clearest expressions of this. Denmark specifically pointed to the need to command an international naval force effectively and conduct escort operations across NATO's Baltic area. Escort work sounds routine until you think through what it means in a tense, narrow sea. It means identifying what must be protected, assigning priority, organizing formation, protecting against air and subsurface threats, and doing all of this while preserving enough flexibility to respond to something unexpected. Escort operations are therefore not just protection missions. They are statements about what a coalition thinks is worth moving and how confidently it believes it can keep those movements alive. That confidence is the true product of BALTOPS. Not certainty, confidence. Certainty is impossible in a real crisis, but confidence is trainable. A coalition can train command relationships. It can train mine warfare procedures. It can train anti-submarine handoffs. It can train amphibious timing and escort discipline. It can train air defense under a shared command structure. What it is really doing in all of those repetitions is buying down friction before friction starts charging interest in wartime. That phrase, wartime, matters because even though BALTOPS is a peacetime exercise, its purpose is openly tied to deterrence. You do not rehearse these mission sets in this geography unless you are trying to shape how an adversary calculates risk. NATO does not need BALTOPS to prove it can hold a ceremony in the Baltic. It needs BALTOPS to show that interference with the region would meet a force that is not only present but organized. Presence without organization is decoration. Organization without practice is theory. BALTOPS is where presence, organization, and practice are brought together in one visible format. It also matters that the exercise is multinational in a real sense, not just a symbolic sense. Danish officials described participation from 16 NATO nations. Sixth Fleet emphasized Allied ships and NATO command relationships. That matters because the Baltic problem is inherently political as well as military. A single navy can patrol water. An alliance has to prove something harder. It has to prove that states with different procedures, different staffs, different habits, and different domestic audiences can still form one functioning maritime picture under stress. That picture is what deterrence depends on. An adversary looking at the Baltic does not only count ships, it also counts likely delays. It asks whether NATO command will be clean or noisy, whether escorts will be timely or hesitant, whether mine clearance will be rapid or politically slowed, whether submarines can create confusion cheaply, whether amphibious options are credible, and whether Allied governments will move at the same speed once things become dangerous. BALTOPS is NATO's answer to those questions. Not a final answer. A visible one. There is a reason the exercise starts from places like Janaya and then spreads across most of the Baltic Sea. A port departure is the easy image. The harder reality begins once the ships leave the harbor and enter a sea where several national coastlines, commercial lanes, and military mission sets all overlap. The Baltic does not offer long stretches of irrelevant water. Almost every movement means something to somebody. That turns basic maritime tasks into political signals very quickly. Even the Danish contribution tells that story. Denmark sent the frigate Absalon with its Seahawk helicopter and used the exercise to strengthen the ability of the Danish task group and naval staff to command an international naval force. That is not just one country adding one ship. It is one of the Baltic region's core naval actors rehearsing how to serve as a command node inside a wider coalition picture. In a real crisis, ships are useful. Command ships are decisive. If the staff picture fails, the extra hulls become far less valuable. That is also why the two-phase exercise structure matters so much. The first phase, unit and combined arms training, sounds almost administrative. In fact, it is where the alliance buys itself speed for later. Crews learn the handoffs. Helos, staffs, escorts, and boarding teams settle their procedures. Controllers establish rhythm. The coalition identifies where one navy's habits fit smoothly with another navy's habits and where they do not. All of that work looks routine right up until the moment a crisis starts, and everyone discovers whether routine is actually produced common instinct. The second phase, the tactical scenario phase, is where the real purpose emerges. The forces are no longer just proving that they can operate. They are proving that they can react. They are forced into realistic scenarios where separate mission sets stop being separate. A mine scare may affect an escort plan. A submarine contact may change amphibious timing. An air defense problem may force commanders to reshuffle risk. A logistics movement may become more important than a symbolic show of force because, without the logistics movement, the rest of the formation begins to lose options. That is how real maritime pressure works in a narrow sea. It rarely comes one problem at a time. This is where unmanned systems experimentation becomes more than a fashionable phrase. Sixth Fleet explicitly included unmanned systems experimentation in the 2026 mission set. In a Baltic context, unmanned systems are useful not because they replace everything else, but because they can widen awareness, extend search, and absorb some risk in water and airspace that remain dangerous for manned platforms. If a coalition wants to search for mines, watch key lanes, or preserve more continuous sensing, then unmanned systems are one of the few ways to increase coverage without endlessly increasing manned exposure. But experimentation cuts both ways. A coalition that experiments in a live exercise is also exposing the fact that it is still learning. That is not weakness. It is realism. BALTOPS is valuable precisely because it puts new tools into a setting where command, timing, and allied interoperability can either support the tool or reveal its limits. That is a more honest form of deterrence than glossy demonstration footage. The same is true of logistics, even when logistics receives less attention than the visible combat tasks. A coalition fleet in the Baltic does not stay ready by declaration. It stays ready because fuel, spare parts, helicopter support, communications links, and staff rhythm all keep functioning while the exercise grows more demanding. In a real crisis, the side that can sustain the routine often outperforms the side that only photographs well at the start. BALTOPS is useful because it forces NATO to test whether the less glamorous supporting functions can keep pace with the more visible operational tasks. That is also why the exercise is so important for smaller and medium allied navies. BALTOPS is one of the places where national forces prove not only that they can contribute a ship, but that they can plug that ship into a real coalition operating system. For an alliance, this is a decisive distinction. The relevant question is not just how many ships exist across all flags. The question is how many ships can actually be commanded, protected, supplied, and employed together at operational speed. Exercises like BALTOPS turn that from a spreadsheet question into a practical one. And the answer matters far beyond the Baltic shoreline. If NATO can organize well in the Baltic, it sends a message about alliance discipline in every other narrow or politically sensitive operating space. If it cannot, that weakness will also travel. Command friction is contagious. So is confidence. The exercise also reveals something about the Baltic reinforcement problem that is easy to miss from a distance. Reinforcement is not just moving troops east, it is preserving the sea lanes and command picture that make any reinforcement credible at all. If escorts cannot protect movement, if mines cannot be cleared, if staffs cannot command mixed formations, or if allied ships cannot share a common tactical picture, then reinforcement becomes slower, narrower, and more vulnerable to political hesitation. A coalition does not need to lose a battle to lose deterrence. It only needs to look uncertain about whether it can organize fast enough. That is why BALTOP is useful to NATO even before a single real crisis appears. It lets the alliance practice the answer to the most dangerous Baltic question. Can many allied systems act as one before an opponent has time to exploit the gap between them? Every part of the exercise points back to that question. Mine warfare points to it because the sea has to be made usable. Air defense points to it because visibility without protection is a liability. Anti-submarine warfare points to it because doubt beneath the water can slow everything above it. The opening from Gdynia matters in that context because it is not only a port call, it is the moment the alliance stops speaking in planning language and starts speaking in movement. Once ships leave harbor, the exercise becomes a test of sequencing. Can staffs push units into the right waters at the right time without losing coherence? Can different navies carry out a shared plan while still using their own ships, crews, procedures, and national caveats? Can the exercise behave like one system instead of a convoy of separate national habits? A narrow sea exposes that question quickly because there is less physical room to hide friction. That is why the command structure change in the official release is such a big detail. Sixth Fleet said BALTOPS 2026 is for the first time since 1972 commanded through Allied Joint Force Command Brunssum under a NATO command structure. That is not ceremonial language. It means the alliance is using the exercise to rehearse a more realistic wartime command rhythm. Staff work becomes part of the training surface. Message flow becomes part of the training surface. Decision speed becomes part of the training surface. If an alliance wants deterrence to feel real, it cannot leave command relationships in a peacetime comfort zone and assume they will sort themselves out later. And later is exactly what the Baltic may not give you. In a compressed maritime theater, the difference between an exercise and a crisis can be measured in hours. A mine warning, a navigation incident, a burst of electronic interference, a damaged undersea cable, or a sudden political order to protect reinforcement traffic can all collapse the planning window. That is why a command structure rehearsal matters. The coalition is not only teaching ships to maneuver, it is teaching headquarters to think, prioritize, and transmit at operational speed while multiple mission sets compete for attention. Mine warfare sits near the center of that whole problem. The Baltic is one of the places in Europe where mine danger never becomes merely historical. Mines do not have to be numerous to be useful to an attacker. They only have to create enough doubt that merchant traffic slows. Naval maneuver becomes more cautious, and clearing forces are pulled into a deliberate and time-consuming proof cycle. That is why the official BALTOPS mission list keeps returning to mine countermeasures. A coalition that cannot clear, verify, and keep routes open under pressure does not just lose mobility, it loses time. And time in the Baltic is one of the most valuable military commodities on the map. Anti-submarine warfare belongs in the same sentence because the Baltic compresses acoustic and geographic problems into a tight operating area. Submarines do not need an enormous ocean to complicate planning. In a sea with dense traffic, mixed salinity layers, shallow zones, and politically sensitive coastlines, the burden is not simply finding a target. It is maintaining enough tracking confidence that escorts and commanders trust the picture they are using. That is where aircraft like the P-8, ships with towed arrays, helicopters, and shared Allied data all start mattering together. The point is not just to find a submarine. The point is to prevent uncertainty about submarines from freezing the rest of the force. The amphibious and literal chapter is equally practical. People hear amphibious and think of dramatic beach assaults, but a Baltic exercise is often working on something more basic and more relevant: how to move useful force across short distances between ports, littorals, islands, and temporary positions without assuming the road network or the sea lane will remain uncontested. The presence of HIMARS transfer footage in recent BALTOPS context is useful because it shows the broader logic. Mobility itself is a weapon. If a coalition can shift fires, troops, engineering assets, and sustainment across water quickly enough, it becomes harder for an opponent to predict where pressure will accumulate next. Escort work sounds less glamorous, but it is one of the most strategically important parts of the exercise. Denmark's description of escort operations is revealing because escort is what turns alliance geography into usable reinforcement. The Baltic is tied to the North Sea through narrow approaches. If a coalition cannot move ships, supply traffic, follow-on forces, or protected commercial movement through those approaches with confidence, then reinforcement becomes a theory instead of a practice. Escort in that sense is not just about guarding one ship. It is about preserving a whole corridor of credibility. That corridor runs through an environment full of civilian movement and fixed infrastructure. The Baltic carries ferries, commercial shipping, fishing traffic, energy infrastructure, and dense national coastlines. That means warships are never operating in a clean laboratory. They are operating in the same space where civilian pattern of life makes detection, attribution, and deconfliction more complicated. A coalition has to maintain order without accidentally creating its own congestion problem. It has to distinguish routine traffic from dangerous anomalies without slowing everything to a halt. That is one reason exercises matter so much there. The Baltic punishes forces that only know how to operate in neat theory. Unmanned systems experimentation belongs here too for the same reason. In a difficult sea, additional eyes, sensors, and remotely operated tools can extend how fast a coalition learns what is happening. But experimentation is only useful if it integrates into command decisions rather than floating beside them as a technology demonstration. BALTOPS is useful as a venue because it lets navies test whether unmanned systems actually shorten the time between detection, understanding, and action. If they do, they raise alliance tempo. If they do not, then the exercise still exposes the gap before a real emergency turns it into a liability. The Baltic also makes repetition valuable. One drill does not prove a force can sustain pressure for days. One successful intercept does not prove a coalition can keep lanes open while rotating ships, managing fatigue, and handling incomplete information. Repeated live work does more than impress observers. It reveals where command posts slow down, where Allied procedures mismatch, where mine clearance takes longer than expected, where routing assumptions break, and where national strengths actually complement each other. Exercises are honest in that way. They take political confidence and expose it to operational friction. There is also a quieter industrial and engineering layer behind an exercise like this. Before the ships sail, equipment has to be loaded, routes deconflicted, ammunition rules settled, maintenance windows respected, and shore support aligned with what the fleet is expected to do once it is underway. That work is easy to ignore because it happens before the dramatic images begin, but it is part of the deterrence story too. A coalition that can only assemble slowly, or only after excessive improvisation, teaches the wrong lesson to both allies and rivals. A coalition that can prepare, load, move, and synchronize on schedule teaches a different lesson entirely. That schedule matters in the Baltic because the operating window is not infinite. Denmark's own description notes that the exercise spans most of the Baltic Sea and runs to June 19. A fixed exercise window forces a coalition to prioritize. It must decide what it most needs to rehearse, what sequence makes sense, which mission sets reveal the most about readiness, and how to use limited time to generate real operational learning. That makes BALTOPS useful, not only as a training event, but as a diagnostic. What the Alliance chooses to emphasize tells you what it believes the Baltic problem actually is. That diagnostic function is useful for allies themselves. Not every navy arrives with the same fear or the same specialty. Some think first about mines. Some think first about undersea threats. Some think first about reinforcement corridors, escort burdens, or coastal air defense. BALTOPS forces those different instincts into one shared operating picture. That matters because Baltic deterrence is not built by identical fleets doing identical tasks. It is built by different fleets, learning how to make each other more useful when the sea starts compressing time and options. And the answer from the 2026 launch is fairly clear. The problem is not just presence. The problem is keeping sea space usable under pressure. That is why the mission list bundles mine warfare, air defense, anti-submarine work, amphibious movement, escorting, crisis response, and unmanned experimentation together, instead of treating them as isolated specialties. In the Baltic, they are not isolated. They overlap. A submarine warning changes escort behavior. A mine scare changes reinforcement timing. An air defense demand changes how command attention is allocated. The exercise matters because it forces the Alliance to handle that overlap in real time rather than admiring each capability one by one. That is why BALTOPS 2026 should be read as more than an annual event. It is an attempt to make NATO's Baltic promises mechanically credible, not rhetorically credible, mechanically credible. Ships have to sail. Staffs have to command. Escorts have to protect. Clearance teams have to verify. Aircraft have to contribute to a picture everyone else trusts. If all of that begins to work together, deterrence becomes more than a statement. It becomes a habit a coalition can perform under pressure. Amphibious operations point to it because mobility and flexibility have to be preserved in a region where fixed assumptions are dangerous. Escort operations point to it because a coalition is only as credible as the traffic it can keep moving. And the command structure points to it because none of the rest works if the Alliance cannot make decisions at operational speed. And that visibility matters because the Baltic is a region where ambiguity can be weaponized quickly. A broken undersea cable, a navigation incident, a mine scare, an airspace violation, or a sudden political crisis can all force navies and governments to make fast choices about movement and protection. The value of a live exercise is that it turns Alliance promises into muscle memory before a real emergency begins testing them. So when the public sees ships leaving Gdynia, it should not stop at the image. It should ask what those ships are actually rehearsing. They are rehearsing how to keep a narrow sea open. They are rehearsing how to deal with mines, submarines, air threats, escort burdens, and coalition command at the same time. They are rehearsing how to make political alliance structure behave like operational capability. That is the tactical meaning of BALTOPS 2026. It is not simply NATO putting steel in the water. It is NATO trying to prove that in the Baltic, under pressure, Allied naval power can still move as one system instead of many separate flags. And in a region where time, space, and trust are all in short supply, that may be the most important rehearsal of all.